So, hello everybody. Today I'm going to do a vlog on another Stephen King series that I'm currently reading, and it's the Dark Tower series. And as you can see, I've got the Gunslinger right behind me. That's Roland, of course. And I was going to do a review of the series after I had read the whole series. But then I thought, well, actually, you shouldn't, because for those of you who know about the Dark Tower series, it was previously published as seven separate, or well, actually six separate volumes, plus the first volume was actually originally published as five discrete short stories that were then later on published as one book. And then a prequel was published as a short story, and then also another volume was published after the last volume of the original series had been published, which kind of is volume 4.5 if we look at the whole series. So what I didn't realize is that Stephen King has been known for making changes to existing works, a lot like I would say Tolkien in a way, because we all know that Tolkien had to change The Hobbit in order to fit what later became part of the Lore of the Ring in The Lord of the Rings. And oh, by the way, this is going to contain spoilers about many works of literature, mainly Stephen King, but maybe others as well. And basically, the first book in the series is called, well, the first book in the original series is called The Gunslinger. And I've got the German version here. So this is the German version, Schwarz. So in keeping with short titles like It, Es, Sie, for she, which is in English misery, they decided to go with really short titles for Stephen King's works. They gave this one the name Black Schwarz. And this is actually a Bertelsmann Lesering copy. And unfortunately, or fortunately, when I bought my Stephen King collection, I decided to thrift. So most of the books are secondhand, which means that they look very eclectic. I've only actually got two books that come from the same series when it comes to the Dark Tower, and they look similar. So this is the first volume, and it is the original version of the original translated version of The Gunslinger. However, later Stephen King went back and changed The Gunslinger slightly. I don't know what the changes are because I haven't read this new version yet. And also, this is a really ugly version of the book. Amazon deceived me. I wanted the one with a nice cover. Instead, I got this. But it's the revised text. And the second book is called The Drawing of the Three, or Drei in German, which is three. So this is one of the huge Heine originals, where they basically went for the jumbo edition. It was also published in this version, and it's 1,500 pages long, and it is quite thick as well. And between these two books, 5 years elapsed. So this one was released in 1982, the original English version, and then this one came in 1987. And then he kept publishing books in this series, and then, as you may know, in 1999, he had a life-changing accident. He was walking, he was a pedestrian somewhere, I want to say in his hometown, and he was run over by a man in a truck, kind of a car, and he was very badly injured, and for a long time he was actually unable, apparently, to sit in front of a typewriter. He was really ill. And then later, a couple of years later, in the early 2000s, he had a relapse based on this accident where he had a serious lung problem and he almost died. So some people, when you listen to people discussing the body of work by Stephen King, say there is a pre-1999 King and a post-1999 King. I cannot actually say if I would see this if I read his work, because I haven't read anything of the later books of his yet. I've only read pre-1999 work or listened to pre-1999 audiobooks. However, the Dark Tower series seems to be overall perceived and received as a really well crafted version of a multiverse, and many of his other books somehow are linked to it. So for example, I have, if you've listened to my Salem's Lot review, there is a character in this book called Father Callahan, and he also appears in the Dark Tower series. If you've read The Stand, there is a character called Randall Flagg, and he's also somehow related to the Dark Tower series. Stephen King apparently has once said that the Man in Black, and I'll get to him, is Randall Flagg in a way. And this is also speculation amongst the fans that this seems to be the same entity. And I'm choosing the word carefully because Randall Flagg is, in my opinion, like Pennywise the clown, a representation of an underlying concept rather than a person or a character per se. So he's a representation, maybe even we could call it a physical manifestation of something underlyingly evil. There is also Insomnia, which relates to the whole story. Apparently also The Dark House. I have not read those, so I cannot tell you. But it's generally accepted that there is, and also Hearts of Atlantis, there are some stuff in there. That's a collection of short stories that is directly linked to the Dark Tower series. Or maybe we could say the Dark Tower series is basically linked to many, many things in his body of work. And the last two books of the original 7-volume series are by some people perceived as a complete break in the series and with the themes of the series. And I will briefly explain to you why. I haven't read them, but I have kind of like learned what some of the story is about. The Dark Tower series, in my opinion, is really difficult to pinpoint when it comes to genre, but that's not a bad thing. I just want to say that this actually just shows the versatility of Stephen King and his mastery, because I believe even the first two books that I've read are masterpieces in their own right. However, in the last two books, Stephen King does something that some people considered a complete break or breaking of the series, because in the last two books, apparently, he introduces a character who is a writer. That's not a new thing, because plenty of characters in Stephen King's body of work are writers. Authors are important to him. But this person's name is Stephen King. So he writes himself into the story as himself, as a character. And he does some things in the story as the character, which some people find questionable at best and completely negating or taking them out of this world that is the Dark Tower completely. However, later on, he wrote another book, an 8th book, and The Wind in the Keyhole. And this book is basically supposed to be read after the first 4 books. So that's where it fits into the narrative, although it was written a lot later. And some say that if you read the books not in the order in which they were published, but bring this one book forward and read it as it were 4.5, the jarring results that were achieved by writing books 6 and 7 are somehow mitigated, or, you know, it's less painful. So this is something that I want to say up front. And I decided not to wait until I had read the whole series, because the series has been published over the course of 2 decades, more than 2 decades. And during that time, lots of things have happened. King has also published other books during that time. Other of his works have been put into films, and, you know, all kinds of other things have happened to his body of work, but also to his person. And I think, I mean, I'm somebody who also says, okay, when it comes to how should I interpret the work of an author, I always go with, if it's not in the text, if the author just says, oh yeah, well, basically I meant this to be like this, I'm like, it's not in the text, buddy, so don't even come to me now and tell me how I should read your text. If it's not in the text, it doesn't exist, because I perceive the text as its own entity. However, I do believe that certain life-changing events can influence the way a writer or anyone sees their work of art or their body of work and decides to change it. And he also went back and rewrote The Gunslinger. So this is basically my prologue. So let's talk about the books. So, and before we do this, I want to quote from Stephen King's own words in the afterword. And I'm going to retranslate it into English for you. Basically, he goes on to say that he doesn't really know at the writing of this, and this is dated 1st of December 1986, so pretty much 37 years ago, almost to the day, because today is the 6th of December 2023, where he says, that he's been asked questions about, or he's been asking himself how this whole journey towards the Dark Tower is going to end. And he says he doesn't know yet. But what I do know is that this story has been calling to me over the span of 17 years. And this second volume always also leaves very many questions unanswered. And the climax of the story is very, very far in the future. But I think that this second volume is much more finished than the first one. And the tower has gotten closer. Now, if we now say 17 years and we take the date 1986, minus 17 is 1969. So he is saying in this book that he has been working on this, or the story that he has been telling for the last 7 years, or 5 years, and is going to keep telling for the next 2 decades without him actually knowing this, has been in his head and in his heart since 1969, since before he published and wrote Carrie, since before he published and wrote It, since before he published and wrote, or not in that order, The Dark Zone, and so on and so forth. So that is a really, really almost Tolkien-esque journey, because we know that Tolkien took decades to write his, or to build his world and then to write his stories in it. So that was something that I didn't quite expect. So I think the fact that it is valid to take each book in turn and even do a review of the series before you finish the series, because he didn't know how it was going to end. He didn't know when it was going to end. He said probably 5 to 6 books. It ended up to be 8 and then plus. So first of all, this is the Gunslinger. This is the terrible movie tie-in. And I'm going to read the first sentence because that's a very, very famous one. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. Before I did this video, I watched a lot of other videos about the Dark Tower and how it's been perceived. The Kingslingers, for example, did a marvelous job. If you just Google the Dark Tower, there are so many things on BookTube where people are critiquing it, where people are discussing it, and so on and so forth. And quite often they say, in which order should you read them? And a lot of people say, well, always insert the 8th book after the 4th book. So we've already discussed this. And some also say, don't just read the first volume, but read the first 2 in one go, because most people will be put off by the first one and they will go, okay, this is weird. And I would posit that this is only if people believe, like I did for a very long time, guilty, that Stephen King equals it. Because it is a horror story, probably masterfully written, but it's a horror story. The Gunslinger isn't. The Gunslinger is an incredibly well-crafted story, which consisted in its original form of 5 different short stories, which were published consecutively and then were put into one volume, but have one thing in common, or many things in common. They tell the story of an unknown person. In the beginning, we don't know the name. We know that he's the gunslinger and he is following the man in black into the desert, and this man in black is running from him. We don't know why, or he's running. So the other one is maybe not running from him, but he is running. Over the course of this story, what we discover, first of all, we live in a dystopian post possibly apocalyptic world, which is not unlike our own, but where technology has died. I mean, at some point they come, or he hears reference to a group of people who worship an old gasoline pump as kind of like a totemistic thing. At a later date, we will also be entering an underground railway system. So these things did exist and now no longer work. Machines and automata did exist, they no longer work. And something must have happened because some things have mutated. There's mention of mutated spiders, but then also we later on encounter something that is best described as zombies. They're called slow mutants. They are kind of human, or used to be human, but they seem to have lost a lot of mental capacity, and they're also very slow. Hence slow mutants. And in this world, there is some form of magic, which the man in black wields, and he is probably not the only one. There are demons, and there are also gunslingers. And gunslingers are a lot like, I would say, knights with guns. So we learn that this gunslinger used to be, was the son of a high-ranking official in a kingdom which no longer exists, which fell in a big fight. And he basically became a gunslinger as other boys of his age did. So they go through rigorous training. Some of this kind of reminded me a little bit of Dune and the way Paul Atreides is trained by this kind of bard trainer. So some of this actually reminded me of this. The story itself is one of, it's a quest, it's the classical quest trope, of course. I mean, he wants to get to the Dark Tower, which we learn later on. It is never quite clear what happens at the Dark Tower or why he's going there, but he needs to go there. The Dark Tower is calling for him. And he's also following that the man in black. And he gets to these different places in the desert. He meets people. He also guns down a whole village because they have been incited by a woman prophet, kind of preacher person, who the black man has impregnated with some demon spawn that the gunslinger named Roland, we learn at some point that his name is Roland, essentially aborts using his gun without killing her. So you can kind of imagine what he may have done with that gun and that woman. And she incites this religious fanaticism in the other villagers, and they try, and it's the village of Tull, and they try to kill him, but he guns all of them down. So he basically just uses his gunslinger abilities, 2 guns blazing, and he just kills everybody. In that town, there's also a love interest of his. He has an affair with her. She is very open about the fact that she just needs a man, and he is the one. And there's also a dead person who then gets, who was revived by the man in black. So the man in black comes to this place. This other guy dies of addiction. So he eats something, some kind of grass, which basically makes him an addict, and he dies from it. And this man in black just revives him using really strange magics. The way this is described is he basically spits on him, and then he jumps over him and lands on his hands, and then jumps back and forth and back and forth. So I was kind of imagining this kind of going, this is more like the Cirque du Soleil trying to do a resurrection of somebody. And it works. And then after he's killed everybody in Tull, he keeps moving. And then he encounters a boy named Jake. And this boy, Jake, is a bit weird. And I mean, everything that I've just told you is weird, but he's especially weird because Roland seems to find out that this boy doesn't really know a lot about the world that they're in. So probably he's not from there, but he knows something about another world. And he describes this other world to him with really tall buildings, which almost scrape the sky. And he describes what we all know are cars. And he also describes, and there I had this total Planet of the Apes vibe. He describes the Statue of Liberty. And of course, he's like, well, there is no such thing. I mean, what would that be? And you're kind of like, yeah, this boy comes from New York City. And we learn that this boy was killed in New York City by somebody who shoved him in front of a car. And this guy was then, and this guy ran away. So, but the boy was run over and died, and he woke up here. And so the two of them travel together, and we've got this trope again of a man who has now found a son, like we have it in Salem's Lot, with Mark Petrie and Ben Mears. So we've got this here as well, Roland and Jake. But it actually becomes quite tragic because they meet an oracle. And the oracle tells Roland in no uncertain terms, if you want to catch the man in black, you have to sacrifice the boy. And he does. He shoves him down a bridge in an underground mine railway situation thingy. And then he spends a lot of time with the man in black. We don't really know what happens. They do have a conversation. And the man in black then says, oh, I've got a tarot deck here. It's kind of a little bit different from your ordinary tarot, but I'm just going to, we're going to do some cards here. And he basically shows him some cards. And he shows him 3 cards. And he says that these basically are the people that you are going to find to help you. And the last card is death. That's very important because he says death, but not yours. And so basically when Roland reappears out of this limbo situation with the man in black, that's the end of the story, actually the end of the book, he is a lot older. His hair is thinned and grayed and he's a lot older. And he keeps walking and he gets to the sea. So he leaves the desert that he has been in and the mountain ranges that he has spent the last however long time with the man in black in, and he arrives at the sea. And then the book ends and we go straight to, and I mean, mind you, people who were reading this had to wait for several years for the next volume to come out. In 1986, then we get the drawing of the three, and here we have again the idea of three cards, and they have been drawn. And he wakes up and he is accosted, attacked by some kind of giant crab thing, and because this guy is exhausted. He has been walking for weeks and months in the desert. He is out of water, he is dehydrated, everything's terrible, and he is completely weakened. And what happens is these crabs come and one of them eats his fingers. If you're a gunslinger and suddenly you lose your fingers, that's going to be difficult. So he loses the most important fingers of his right hand. So now he only has his left hand that he can use. So he's one hand down. And he also has to teach himself how to do everything with his left hand that he used to use his right hand for. Especially taking apart a revolver with only one hand, you know, quite difficult. And also another thing, some of his ammunition gets wet. And he believes now that there's going to be duds in there that will not be working. So, problematic. And he keeps dragging himself down that beach and he sees out of nowhere a door. And he walks past it and then the door is gone. He can only see its shadow, but then he goes back again. And the door is only this wide, so he can basically see it from the side. But if he goes behind it, the door is gone, but he can still see the shadow. So it's a really weird thing. So he notices straight away, oh, there's something really strange here. And basically what happens is he's going to find 3 of these doors, one for each of the people that were drawn in the original tarot session with the man in black. And he basically meets 3 people. And each of these stories is incredible. Because what happens is he enters our world at different times and has interesting interactions there. So the first one that he enters is he doesn't only enter the world, but he enters a person in that world, the particular person that has been foretold he's going to meet. So the first one is a man named Eddie, who is a drug addict and who is a drug mule who has been sent to Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, somewhere there. And he's also an addict. So he's been asked to get drugs and smuggle them into New York City by plane. And the next pages are just basically he's in this body. He doesn't understand what's going on. He's never been on a plane. He's like, what the? We are flying? I mean, it takes a while for him to understand that they're flying. He also always mistakes he thinks that the air hostesses are actually soldiers because they wear uniform, and that this guy, Eddie, is going to perform a ritual called going through customs. I just find that, I mean, when we think of today, 2023, what it takes for anyone to go through airport security and then get on a plane and then think about doing this in a country where you also have to go through customs. Flying in the European Union, of course, thankfully you don't have to do this. But back then, of course, you know, coming in from a known drug island, of course, that would probably have been quite a normal thing to do. It is a ritual. I mean, it is a ritual. So he believes that this is some kind of shamanistic, occult ritual that he has to perform in order to be allowed to proceed, which is true. Without doing this, he can't proceed. And it's all of this story about how he's trying to help Eddie do this, because Eddie is now completely freaked out because there is this guy in his head who keeps talking to him, and what the hell is going on? And it is extremely entertaining and it's extremely funny, but it is also like it becomes very tragic because Eddie has a brother who is completely d- gone down that road of heroin. It's really terrible. He is, yeah, he's beyond repair, and basically Eddie ends up in custody, but they can't prove anything because the gunslinger, Roland, who is at this stage really sick because he's also suffering from blood poisoning because he has been bitten by this and chewed up by this crab thing, and he's delirious, has taken the drugs into his world because he knows that he can take stuff from this world into his world and then bring it back. So he's managed to convince Eddie, give me the drugs and I'll put them somewhere where they are safe. And when you are out past the ritual, I'll give them back to you and you can hand them to the drug boss who's contracted you and who is holding your brother hostage or whatever you want to call it until you return until you return with the drugs. So they do that, and long story short, things go awry. There is a shootout, but his brother is already dead, and he actually died from an overdose. He isn't killed, or is he killed? Is he murdered? I can't even. No, he just dies. I mean, yeah, he's just dead. And Roland persuades Eddie to come with him, and the two of them go into Roland's world with a couple of packages of some kind of antibiotic, which does help, but unfortunately it's not enough. We learn that later. And of course, now the problem with Eddie is he's a drug addict, and he's not doing well because he now doesn't have any drugs, and he's basically trying to be weaned off of the drugs. And it's a really interesting way in which this is told. And what I always find so interesting is the tenderness with which Roland and Eddie interact, and the love that is clearly there between them. It's a wonderful friendship story that evolves between the two. Then they come to the next door, and again they open it, and this time he ends up in the head of a lady named Odetta Holmes. She is and he finds out as he's in her body that there's something weird about her. Basically, she is an African-American woman, very rich. Her father made money in dentistry, and he's got this kind of like, I think he patented a way of doing some dentistry stuff, and he's rich and she's richer. And he's dead, so she's inherited everything. She lives in New York City. It's before Eddie's time. I want to say Eddie's is in the 70s and Odetta's time is in the 60s maybe, or late 50s. It's and basically she also goes to the south and protests, and she is somebody who was pushed in front of a train, comes important later, and lost both her legs in the underground. And we learn something else about her. And we learn it as Roland learns it, because there's something weird going on in her head. I mean, apart from the fact that Roland is there now, there's also somebody else. And it turns out that Odetta is schizophrenic, and there's a second person in her that's called Detta Walker, who is completely different from the well-educated, highly educated, high-class, upper-class Odetta Holmes. She is like, she swears like a sailor. She sees everyone who is white as the enemy. And this is basically also, I mean, she also treats everybody very badly who's white. She swears at them. And it takes a while for him to realize what's going on, but Roland also takes a long time to realize that Odetta and Detta don't know that the other one exists. They both lose time, but they don't know why. And so a lot of the story is about how then he brings Odetta / Detta back in her wheelchair, and how then the story unfolds and how the two switch, and what happens when Odetta comes to the front and what happens when Detta comes to the front. And it is extremely well written, and it's extremely it just reads really quickly. And basically, again, he needs even more medication because he doesn't have enough of the antibiotics, and he's clearly dying. So he sends Roland and Odetta / Detta down the beach to find the third door, then come and get him so that he can go through. Because he needs to go through. He can take somebody else with him, but he needs to go through. And the problem is that as long as Odetta is there, while Odetta is a bit surprised about this whole thing, oh, I'm in a new world, what the hell is going on? It's fairly okay. And it's actually going well. And Odetta and Eddie fall in love. But Detta, there is no love lost between Detta and the world. For Detta, everything in this world and in any other world, and especially if this is a white person, is the enemy. And there is a lot of tension, and it leads to Detta taking over and then basically trying to kill the two of them. A very, very tense, I don't know how many pages, but I was kind of like on the edge of my seat because this is Stephen King. I was like, okay, maybe she's going to kill Eddie. I don't think she's going to kill Roland because we kind of need Roland, but I'm not so sure if we need Eddie. I need Eddie because everybody needs an Eddie in their life because it's an extremely powerful character. But I wasn't sure where this was going to go because then they go through the third door. And again, that is kind of like in the 80s, maybe the beginning of the 80s or maybe 1979, but definitely on the cusp, because we learn later that the Terminator came out a couple of years later, the first movie, and one of the protagonists in the third story actually went to see that movie. Because as I was reading the third chapter, I was like, this guy is like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator. And later on, actually, it's like, this guy goes to the cinema, he's like, oh my God, that guy, that Arnold Schwarzenegger is exactly like that guy I once met. So essentially in the last chapter, which is the death chapter, that's the death tarot card, we get to know the person. Oh, and one more thing. Why is Odetta / Detta schizophrenic? Because as a child, someone threw a brick from a house onto her head and she had a head injury. Again, this is a little bit reminiscent of Dead Zone, where we also have somebody who's got a head injury, twice even, and who then gets supernatural powers. So here we have like this head injuries can lead to psychological problems or psychiatric problems, psychological problems. So trauma to the head, to the brain can lead to all kinds of problems, also personality disorders. Anyway, so we enter the head of a man who's kind of like a bookkeeper, or not kind of, I think it's his job. I think he's a bookkeeper, and he's a killer. So he's death, but not yours. And he is the man that killed Jake, that shoved Jake in front of the car. He's the man who shoved Odetta in front of the train, and he's also the man who threw the brick at Odetta when she was a child. And he's killed other people as well. And essentially, the gunslinger Roland takes this guy over, and he has no love for him. He's like, you are evil and I despise you, and I'm gonna do terrible things to you. And he does, because in the end he makes sure that this guy dies. But he does many other things in between. First of all, he gets himself, he basically decides to get weapons, because obviously, or well, basically more, he decides to get bullets, because he's run out of bullets. He only ever had very few to begin with, and now of course some of them are wet, so they're not working. So they go to a gun shop, and I was thinking, okay, this is so Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator, where he's like, show me that Uzi 9mm, and he goes through all of those, and basically then says, and then the guy says, okay, which one is it going to be? And he's like, all of them. And he just basically takes all of them, loads one, and then basically the guy says, oh, you cannot put the bullets into the gun here in the shop. And he's like, watch me, and kills him. And it's the exact same situation. So he goes there and looks at the weapons, and then he says, okay, well, I need ammunition. And he's like, okay, so what kind of ammunition do you need? And the gunslinger Roland doesn't know how to talk about it, because he apparently probably makes his own ammunition, so it's hand cast or whatever. And so he says, do you have, well, it's for my brother, so do you have a catalog of weapons? And then I will tell you which weapon he has, and then you can show me what kind of ammunition goes with that. So he gives him this, and he looks at it, and then he says, okay, well, you're going to need this, 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 and this caliber, whatever. And he says, okay, so I'm going to take one. And he says, do you have this in stock? He's like, yeah, I've got plenty of boxes. And he's like, okay, so how many are there in one box? And he's like, 50. And to Roland, this is like Christmas and Easter on the same day. I mean, 50 bullets in one go. And he's like, he can't even imagine that he's hearing this. And he's like, okay, then I'm going to take 4 boxes. So he takes an amount of ammunition, which is easy to buy. So apparently it's fine to sell 200 bullets in this particular context. But for him, this is like unprecedented to get this large number of bullets in one go. And then there's a lot of shenanigans about how he cannot pay for it, blah, 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 but it does work out. So he then pulls a really interesting stunt. I'm not going to go into any details, because it is just so well written, so well crafted, and it's really funny in a way as well. Then they also go and he needs penicillin in effect, and they want to go to a pharmacy, and basically the guy in the pharmacy thinks that this is that he's being robbed. And he's like, I'm the only pharmacist who will ever be robbed for penicillin. Everybody else just wants opioids. And I'm like, yeah. And so he basically then gets it. There's also police involvement. One or two shots are fired. I don't think anybody dies. And then he kills the last one. He doesn't bring that one back, because that guy is simply evil. And he returns and he starts taking his medicine again, and he gets well. And somehow, and I forget how that happened, but Detta and Odetta, yes, he manages to integrate Detta and Odetta by showing each of them that the other exists, and they come together, and this whole fractioning of Odetta / Detta's personality, this fragmenting, is resolved, and she gives herself a new name. She calls herself Susanna, and she kind of marries Eddie. So the two of them are now a couple. And Roland says, well, I love you both. And like, really, I think it's totally platonic between Roland and Susanna. So I don't think that there is anything going on there. But it's, again, this profound love that exists between the characters, and King captures it so well, like this laconic, well, I love you both. I mean, it's just so well written, and it's just so, in spite of everything, in a way, this is wholesomeness, this is peace, this is love in a completely crazy situation, because we are now back in Roland's world. We've just had portal fantasy, 3 different times in New York City, and it's been crazy. I mean, each of these episodes is just crazy. It would have been, I mean, you could turn each of these into a film. You know, they're just so well written. Having said this, the German version has around 450 pages, so the English version would be slightly shorter because German has more words. I read it in one day. It's an absolute page turner. So this is where we're at now. We know that we need to go to the Dark Tower. We know that there's a man in black, and he is evil because, you know, there's definitely something going on there. He's probably responsible in a way for the downfall of the kingdom where Roland grew up in. And Roland has now got a found family, very important, and he's now got allies that will help him get to the Dark Tower. And if I say, okay, now he's got allies and they go to the Dark Tower with him, I make it sound like, oh, this is a done deal and basically everybody's on board with this and yeah, let's go to the Dark Tower. It's not so. They are very critical of the mission, and there is a lot of ups and downs in their personal relationships where they're like, you know, you would sacrifice everything just to get there. And it's true because we saw them kill Jake. I mean, in the other timeline, in the death portal situation, he does save Jake because he makes sure that this guy doesn't get to push Jake in front of the car. So Jake is saved in the real, well, not in the real world, because to Roland, of course, his world is the real world. In the world that Jake lives in, Jake doesn't die. So now we're in the situation, if Jake doesn't die, then he would not have met Roland earlier, because in order to do this, he had to die. So Roland would never have met the man in black, and he wouldn't have had the tarot. So here we have again a conundrum. I don't know if this is going to be addressed at some point, or if Stephen King has a solution to it. But of course, this would be a side effect of making sure that Jake doesn't die. But this is the situation that we're in at the moment. And I cannot wait to read the 3rd book. The problem is I've got it here. So I kept thrifting. So each of these, except for 2, look completely different. But they're a Christmas present. I will not get them until the 24th. They are in my library. I'm not touching them. I've looked at them and I'm like, oh, you look beautiful. But I can't read them yet. So this is going to take a while. But I will probably do it like I said at the beginning. I'm going to read the 3rd book and then do a review instead of waiting until I've read all of them, because that makes it a lot more realistic, because each person had to wait until, if you were reading it at the time when they were released, until they came out. And one more word, because I said at the beginning that in his afterword, Stephen King says that he believes that the 2nd book is a lot more a standalone book than the 1st. And I would say, yes, you can just take this book and read it. Absolutely. But I would say you can also take The Gunslinger and read it on its own. Because I would like to go back to what I said earlier, that people say, read both of them in one go, because The Gunslinger will put you off. I totally disagree. It really depends on your preconceptions of what you think Stephen King's prose is like. If you come from It and The Shining and you read this and you expect to get It and The Shining, you will be totally disappointed. Absolutely, because the tone is completely different. Mind you, the same goes for this. There is no horror in here. Except maybe for those crabs. They were kind of horrific. I didn't like them. But it is a completely different story. The vibes are completely different. And it may come as a surprise to people who expect Stephen King to write horror stories and only horror stories, because now I know he doesn't. Yes, there is supernatural in there, but I would say this is fantasy. I mean, this is fantasy. Definitely, this is portal fantasy, and this is kind of like Wild West fantasy. And again, this has got Wild West tropes. So you've got the lone gunman, like Clint Eastwood type. He comes into a town, he is on a mission, blah blah blah. You've got your saloon type establishment. So, but the thing is, King understands those tropes. He understands the Western trope, like Western adventures, you know, the Wild West. And he takes it and then he turns it into something different. So it's what I like about my fantasy. And when we're also playing games, for example, where we say we want to set them in our world and then just turn the dial by 1 degree so that it's New York City, but not quite. Paris, but not quite. And that's what he does. And here, of course, we have this added thing of it's post-apocalyptic, and maybe we will learn at some point what actually happened. And this is Stephen King. So he references not only tropes, he also references other works of literature. He references pop culture. He actually references the Terminator movie. So I don't want to even start talking about his erudition. He is extremely well-read, versatile, and he just knows so much, and he has read so much that he is able to draw upon a vast plethora of literary works. And I would like to close this off with the information that, of course, the Dark Tower in and of itself is a reference to Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which is a very, very famous, and I don't know if it's referenced in here at all, if they actually quote from it. Anyway, so you might want to read this. I haven't read it yet. Oh, well, I actually have, but I haven't read it in a very long time. But this is what inspired it. Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. So here we've got Roland and we've got the Dark Tower, and they're both behind me. So I would like to thank you for listening. I am really, really happy that I have discovered this epic work by Stephen King, and I'm really enjoying it. And yeah, and I would like to encourage you, if you haven't read it yet, do pick it up. And also check out discussions on the internet. There are so many really, really good Stephen King related podcasts and YouTube videos that discuss these in depth, that I can only recommend. Of course, there will be spoilers. Some of them are spoiler free. They are very good, but I don't think you get as much out of them if you haven't read the book. Because if they're trying to stay spoiler free, it's going to be at a very high meta level, which again may not actually help you if you haven't read the books in the first place. But this is all from me. So I wish you a pleasant holiday season coming up, and we will talk again about Stephen King. Talk to you soon. Bye.